Hollywood is a place built on illusions. Its red carpets and flashing cameras tell a story of dreams fulfilled, of legends being born beneath the spotlights. But behind that glamorous curtain lies a much darker reality, one that few dare to face. For every star that rises, there is another whose light burns out far too quickly, consumed by the very fame that once seemed like a blessing. Few stories illustrate that brutal truth more than the rise and fall of Ezra Miller. Ezra Miller was not just another Hollywood hopeful. From the moment they stepped into the spotlight, Miller was hailed as a once-in-a-generation talent. Their breakout role in We Need to Talk About Kevin sent shockwaves through audiences, and soon, Miller became a household name with the perks of being a wallflower. Charismatic, bold, and unafraid to push boundaries, Miller embodied the rebellious spirit of a new era. They weren't simply an actor, they were a symbol, a voice for outsiders, for those who didn't fit neatly into Hollywood's traditional molds. But fame is a dangerous currency. The very qualities that made Ezra Miller magnetic on screen, the intensity, the unpredictability, the refusal to conform, would later spiral into something darker. By the mid-2010s, Miller had secured one of Hollywood's most coveted roles as the Flash in Warner Brothers' massive DC franchise. To fans, it seemed like the perfect match, a young, vibrant star embodying a superhero defined by speed and energy. Yet behind the scenes, cracks were already beginning to show. The headlines would come like thunderclaps, each one more shocking than the last. Bar fights in Hawaii, strange encounters in Iceland, arrests, accusations, restraining orders. At first, the public didn't know what to believe. Was this the eccentric behavior of a troubled artist, or the unraveling of someone dangerously out of control? Hollywood, meanwhile, faced a dilemma. Could the industry still embrace a star whose name had become synonymous with scandal? And so, a story once filled with promise began to take on the shape of tragedy. Ezra Miller's life became a cautionary tale, a haunting reminder that in Hollywood, the line between legend and infamy is razor thin. This is not just the story of a star who lost their way. It is a journey into the shadows of fame itself, where the spotlight blinds and the darkness consumes. To understand Ezra Miller's rise and eventual fall, we must first look back at where it all began. Born on September 27, 1992, in Wyckoff, New Jersey, Ezra Matthew Miller was the youngest of 3 children in a relatively affluent family. Their father, Robert S. Miller, was a publisher who worked with major companies like Hyperion Books, while their mother, Marta, was a dancer with modern influences who passed on to her child a love for performance and expression. The Millers were a family of comfort and privilege, yet even within that environment, Ezra carried a sense of being different from the start. At the age of 6, Ezra developed a severe speech impediment that made communication a struggle. To help overcome it, their parents enrolled them in opera training. Opera might seem an unusual remedy, but for Ezra, it became a sanctuary. Singing allowed them to discover control, rhythm, and above all, confidence. By the time they were a child, Ezra was already performing with the Metropolitan Opera, a rare achievement for someone so young. Those early years instilled in them a passion for performance that would guide the rest of their life. School, however, was never an easy place. Miller attended the Hudson School and later Rockland Country Day School, but their eccentricities and intense personality often set them apart from their peers. They were drawn to artistic expression and often clashed with the rigid norms of the classroom. Ezra has described feeling like an outsider from a young age, a theme that would echo both in their later roles and in their public identity. By their mid-teens, Miller identified as queer, refusing to conform to labels that Hollywood so often tried to impose. Their first major break came in 2008 with After School, directed by Antonio Campos. Playing a teenager who accidentally films the overdose of 2 classmates, Miller delivered a performance both haunting and unsettling. Critics quickly took notice, praising the depth and maturity of someone barely 16 years old. Hollywood had found a new prodigy, and casting directors began circling. The real turning point came in 2011 with the release of We Need to Talk About Kevin. Cast as Kevin Kachadurian, a sociopathic teenager responsible for a school massacre, Miller delivered a performance that was chilling in its precision and terrifying in its realism. Acting alongside Tilda Swinton, Miller proved that they could hold their own against some of the industry's finest. Critics described the performance as unforgettable and career-defining. Suddenly, Ezra Miller was no longer just a promising young actor, they were a star. Later that year, Miller cemented their rising reputation with the perks of being a wallflower. As Patrick, the charismatic and witty outsider, Miller connected with audiences on a deeply personal level. They brought charm, vulnerability, and defiance to the role, instantly becoming a symbol for misfits and marginalized youth. Fans didn't just watch Ezra Miller on screen, they saw themselves reflected in the character. Hollywood had a new darling, and the world seemed to be at Miller's feet. The early years of Ezra's career were marked by critical acclaim and a sense of unstoppable momentum. They were the outsider who had broken through, the unconventional star who promised to shake Hollywood's foundations. For a time, it seemed as though Ezra Miller could do no wrong. But as the spotlight grew brighter, so too did the pressures and temptations lurking just beyond its glow. By the mid-2010s, Ezra Miller's career was reaching heights that most young actors only dream about. After the critical acclaim of We Need to Talk About Kevin and the cult success of The Perks of Being a Wallflower, Miller became one of the most sought-after talents in Hollywood. Directors admired their intensity, casting agents admired their versatility, and fans admired their unapologetic authenticity. In an industry that often thrives on conformity, Ezra stood out as someone who refused to fit into a box, and that difference became their greatest selling point. It wasn't long before Hollywood's biggest studios came calling. In 2014, Warner Brothers announced that Ezra Miller would play Barry Allen, better known as The Flash, in the DC Extended Universe. The casting shocked many. At just 21 years old, Miller was an unconventional choice for a role that required both humor and heroism, but the announcement electrified the industry. Ezra Miller wasn't just becoming a star, they were stepping into the rarefied realm of superhero icons, joining the ranks of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. The years that followed marked the peak of Miller's professional success. In 2016, they appeared as Creedence Barebone in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, a franchise tied to the beloved Harry Potter universe. It was another career-defining moment, placing them in one of the most lucrative film series in the world. For Warner Brothers, Miller was no longer just a promising young actor. They were an investment, a multi-franchise star with the potential to carry billion-dollar films on their shoulders. Off-screen, Ezra Miller became a darling of the fashion world. With their sharp cheekbones, daring outfits, and refusal to adhere to gender norms, Miller was a red carpet phenomenon. They wore gowns to premieres, makeup to galas, and outfits that blurred the line between masculine and feminine. Fashion magazines hailed them as a pioneer, Vogue featured them as a gender-fluid icon, and fans around the globe celebrated their courage to defy expectations. In a time when Hollywood was beginning to grapple with questions of identity and representation, Ezra Miller became a cultural touchstone. Their interviews only added to the mystique. Candid, unpredictable, and often philosophical, Miller gave answers that seemed to come from a place far outside Hollywood's typical media training. They spoke openly about queerness, about breaking down traditional boundaries, and about redefining what it meant to be a celebrity. For many young people, Ezra became more than an actor. They became a symbol of liberation. Financially, Miller's star power was also at its peak. With two massive franchises and growing critical acclaim, they commanded attention at every turn. Magazines called them the future of Hollywood. Warner Brothers executives spoke of The Flash as a cornerstone of the DC universe, with Miller set to headline their own solo film. The possibilities seemed endless. And yet, beneath the glow of red carpets and blockbuster premieres, there were already whispers of instability. On the surface, Ezra Miller's golden era was a story of triumph, of a young outsider who had conquered the most exclusive industry in the world. But success often comes with hidden costs. Hollywood is not kind to those who live on the edge, and the same qualities that made Ezra a star, the intensity, the eccentricity, the refusal to conform, would soon begin to lead them down a darker path. For now, though, in the eyes of the world, Ezra Miller stood at the pinnacle of fame. They were the star who could do it all, a critically acclaimed actor, a blockbuster lead, a fashion icon, and a cultural figurehead. The golden era of Ezra Miller had arrived, but like so many before them, it would not last forever. At the height of Ezra Miller's success, it was easy to believe the narrative of an unstoppable star. They had two blockbuster franchises, an ever-growing fan base, and a reputation as Hollywood's daring outsider. But even as the industry and the public celebrated their rise, subtle cracks were beginning to show beneath the polished image. Fame, pressure, and personal demons were converging in ways that would soon spill into public view. The earliest signs came not in headlines, but in whispers. Colleagues noted Miller's unpredictability on set, moments of brilliance followed by sudden outbursts or erratic behavior. While Hollywood often tolerates eccentricity in its stars, Miller's volatility began to raise questions. Behind the camera flashes and magazine spreads, there was an unease building, a sense that Ezra's intensity was no longer just an artistic quirk, but a warning sign. By the late 2010s, those whispers became stories. Miller's nightlife became the subject of increasing fascination and concern. They were seen at parties where the excesses of Hollywood's underbelly, alcohol, drugs, and chaotic behavior were on full display. For someone already under the pressure of carrying 2 major film franchises, the temptations of excess were dangerous. And for Ezra, who had always lived on the edges of identity and performance, the line between personal freedom and self-destruction grew increasingly blurred. In 2017, an incident during the promotion of Justice League hinted at what was to come. A video surfaced of Miller choking a woman outside a bar in Reykjavik, Iceland. The footage shocked fans and the media alike. Some dismissed it as a misunderstanding or an out-of-context moment, but the image of Miller's hands around a fan's neck was impossible to ignore. For the first time, the public saw a darker side of the actor, a side that clashed violently with the charming, eccentric persona they had carefully cultivated. The Iceland incident should have been a wake-up call, but instead it marked the beginning of a troubling pattern. Over the next few years, Miller's behavior became increasingly erratic. Reports emerged of heated confrontations, cryptic social media posts, and behavior that even close friends found disturbing. The mystique that once made Miller magnetic was beginning to curdle into something more unsettling. At the same time, their career, still strong on the surface, began to feel fragile. The long-delayed production of The Flash only added to the pressure, with rumors swirling about script changes, directorial exits, and uncertainty over Miller's role. For Warner Brothers, who had invested heavily in Miller as a cornerstone of the DC extended universe, the stakes were enormous. But as Miller's personal controversies grew louder, the studio found itself in an impossible position: defend its star or risk the collapse of its billion-dollar franchise plans. For fans, the dissonance was painful. This was the actor who had embodied characters of vulnerability, who had symbolized freedom and authenticity. Yet here was the same person caught in disturbing headlines, acting in ways that betrayed the trust of those who had once admired them. It was no longer just a story of a troubled artist. It was becoming the story of a public unraveling. The cracks in Ezra Miller's carefully constructed image were no longer invisible. They were spreading, widening with each new report, each unsettling video, each whispered story that leaked into the press. What began as isolated incidents was coalescing into a portrait of a star in crisis. Hollywood had seen this story before, but with Miller, the stakes felt higher. They weren't just a rising actor, they were the face of an entire generation of films. And as the cracks deepened, it became clear that the golden era was over. When the cracks in a carefully polished image begin to show, Hollywood often looks the other way, at least for a time. The industry has a long history of excusing erratic behavior from its stars, especially when there are millions of dollars at stake. But for Ezra Miller, the tide of tolerance would not last. What had once been whispered rumors and isolated incidents soon exploded into an avalanche of headlines that painted a picture too dark to ignore. The breaking point came in early 2022. Miller was arrested in Hawaii after a string of disturbing events. Police reported that they had become violent in a karaoke bar, yelling obscenities, grabbing a microphone from a woman singing, and later lunging at a man playing darts. When authorities intervened, Miller was taken into custody for disorderly conduct and harassment. For fans who had followed their career from the days of the perks of being a wallflower, the news was almost surreal. This was the same actor who once charmed audiences with their charisma and vulnerability, now reduced to bar fights and mugshots. But the Hawaii arrest was only the beginning. Just weeks later, Miller was arrested again on the island, this time for second-degree assault after allegedly throwing a chair that struck a woman. These back-to-back arrests transformed Miller from an eccentric Hollywood figure into a symbol of instability. The press seized on every detail, from the bizarre police reports to the haunting images of Miller looking disheveled in custody. Overnight, the narrative of a troubled genius gave way to something darker, the image of a star in free fall. Then came the accusations that went beyond drunken outbursts or violent altercations. Families began coming forward with claims that Miller had manipulated or endangered young people. In June 2022, the parents of an 18-year-old activist sought a protective order, alleging that Miller had groomed their child from the age of 12. Although the accusations were contested and complicated, the headlines were devastating. Other stories followed, with individuals accusing Miller of creating cult-like environments, brandishing weapons, and using their fame to intimidate those around them. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch. Miller was no longer being described as a Hollywood rebel or a misunderstood artist. They were being cast as a dangerous figure, someone who had crossed the line from troubled celebrity into something far more alarming. For Warner Brothers, the studio that had once bet its entire superhero slate on Miller, the scandal was catastrophic. Questions swirled about whether The Flash, a film that had cost over $200 million to produce, could even be released. Executives scrambled behind the scenes, weighing the future of the franchise against the mounting public outrage. Fans were divided. Some defended Miller, pointing to their struggles with mental health and the pressures of fame. Others turned away completely, unable to reconcile the actor they had admired with the figure in the headlines. Social media amplified every development, every rumor, every photograph of Miller on the run from law enforcement or appearing in court. What had once been a promising career became a cautionary tale unfolding in real time, with the entire world watching. In August 2022, as the storm of allegations threatened to swallow everything, Miller issued a rare public statement. They acknowledged suffering from complex mental health issues and announced that they had begun treatment. It was an admission that many had long suspected was necessary, but for some, it was too little, too late. The damage to their reputation was already profound, and the scars on their career were deep. Hollywood, of course, has always loved a redemption story. Studios, fans, and the media have all forgiven stars in the past after periods of scandal or collapse. But with Miller, the situation felt uniquely precarious. Their controversies had become so numerous, so public, and so disturbing that the path back to glory seemed almost impossible. For Warner Brothers, the question was no longer whether Ezra Miller was the star of the future. It was whether they were a liability too great to keep. By the end of 2022, Ezra Miller's collapse was undeniable. What had once been a career built on critical acclaim, blockbuster franchises, and cultural influence had devolved into a series of arrests, accusations, and apologies. The young star who once symbolized freedom and defiance had become trapped in their own chaos, their name now synonymous not with promise, but with scandal. The collapse of Ezra Miller was not sudden. It was the result of years of pressure, indulgence, and unchecked behavior. But when it came, it was total. Hollywood's golden child had fallen, and the question now was whether there was any way back. Every Hollywood downfall has a moment when it stops being just another scandal and transforms into tragedy. For Ezra Miller, that moment came when the headlines no longer sounded like isolated chaos, but instead read like the unraveling of a life. What had once been eccentricity had become danger. What had once been brilliance had turned into desperation. And for many, watching it unfold was less like following a celebrity story and more like witnessing a slow-motion disaster. By late 2022 and into 2023, Miller's troubles were no longer limited to bar fights or cryptic interviews. Reports emerged of them squatting on properties, carrying weapons, and behaving in ways that frightened those around them. In Vermont, police investigated Miller for harboring a mother and her 3 children at their farm, where dangerous weapons allegedly lay scattered around the property. Court documents claimed that the environment was unsafe, and the story fed into a growing perception of Miller not just as unstable, but as actively threatening. For a star once associated with empathy and openness, it was a devastating reversal. The legal troubles mounted. Burglary charges, harassment claims, restraining orders. The list of accusations seemed endless. What shocked the public most was not only the sheer number of incidents, but the speed with which they piled up. Almost every month brought a new headline, each one more troubling than the last. For fans, the experience was disorienting. This was not the Ezra Miller they thought they knew. The actor who once symbolized resilience and individuality now seemed consumed by paranoia and violence. Hollywood had seen its share of troubled stars, but the Miller case stood apart because of its intensity and its timing. The DC Extended Universe, already struggling to compete with Marvel, had staked much of its identity on The Flash. Warner Brothers had poured millions into Miller's image, into posters that featured their face, into commercials that presented them as the future of the franchise. Now all of that investment seemed on the brink of collapse. For Warner executives, the nightmare was twofold. Not only was Miller's career in ruins, but their downfall threatened to drag an entire cinematic universe down with it. In 2023, as The Flash prepared for release, Warner Brothers faced a choice. Would they scrap the film entirely, write off hundreds of millions, and distance themselves from Miller forever? Or would they release it and risk associating their brand with one of Hollywood's most controversial figures? In the end, they chose the latter, releasing the film with minimal promotion from its embattled star. The gamble did little to pay off. Though some praised Miller's performance, the shadow of their scandals was too large to escape. The film's underwhelming box office only deepened the sense that Ezra Miller's presence had poisoned what should have been a triumphant moment. For Miller personally, the aftermath was even more severe. They issued apologies, citing mental health struggles and committing to treatment, but the public mood had shifted. Sympathy was in short supply. Too many people had been hurt, too many stories had emerged, and too much damage had been done. Hollywood, which once adored their fearlessness, now regarded them with suspicion. Invitations to premieres dried up. Fashion houses that once hailed them as icons moved on, and former fans abandoned them in droves. Perhaps the most tragic element of Miller's downfall was not the loss of fame or fortune, but the loss of trust. For years, they had been a beacon for young people who felt different, who saw in Miller a reflection of their own struggles and defiance. That connection was shattered. Instead of inspiration, Miller's name became a cautionary tale whispered on internet forums and dissected in late-night monologues. By the time the dust began to settle, Ezra Miller was no longer a star on the rise, nor even a star in free fall. They were something worse, a ghost hovering at the edge of Hollywood, too controversial to embrace and too infamous to ignore. The tragic bottom had been reached, not with a single cataclysmic event, but with a steady accumulation of chaos that left nothing of the legend intact. In Hollywood, every star must eventually face the shadows. For Ezra Miller, those shadows did not just arrive, they consumed everything. Hollywood is a machine that thrives on myth-making. It builds idols, elevates them to unreachable heights, and then, when the narrative shifts, it tears them down with equal intensity. The story of Ezra Miller is one of the clearest examples of this cycle in recent memory. Yet Miller's legacy, if it can even be called that, is far more complicated than a simple tale of rise and fall. It is a reflection of the cultural moment in which they lived, a mirror of both Hollywood's excesses and society's shifting values. At the height of their career, Miller represented progress. They stood as a symbol of gender fluidity, queerness, and artistic nonconformity at a time when the entertainment industry was only beginning to grapple with inclusivity in a serious way. Their boldness on red carpets, their refusal to conform to labels, and their outspoken advocacy made them a cultural icon for young people searching for representation. For many fans, Ezra Miller was more than an actor. They were proof that it was possible to succeed in Hollywood without abandoning individuality. But legacy is fragile, and Miller's collapse revealed the dark side of idolization. When accusations of violence, manipulation, and instability surfaced, the betrayal felt personal for those who had once seen them as a voice of liberation. The fall of Ezra Miller raised uncomfortable questions about how society elevates celebrities to symbolic status, only to watch them fail under the impossible weight of expectation. Was Miller a victim of a culture that demanded perfection, or were they simply another celebrity consumed by their own recklessness? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. For Hollywood, Miller's story is a cautionary tale about risk and accountability. Studios that once overlooked troubling behavior in pursuit of profit now face backlash for protecting a star whose controversies harmed real people. The case forced conversations about how far the industry is willing to go to preserve billion-dollar franchises, even when the cost is public trust. In this way, Miller's downfall is not just about one individual, but about the structures that enabled them. Culturally, Miller's story also touches on the complexities of separating art from the artist. Their performances remain powerful. We need to talk about Kevin, and the perks of being a wallflower continue to resonate with audiences, but can those works be celebrated without acknowledging the turmoil that followed? Some argue that the art should stand apart, while others insist that ignoring the harm done by celebrities perpetuates a cycle of impunity. Ezra Miller, willingly or not, became the center of that debate. There is also the broader societal question of mental health. Miller's acknowledgement of complex mental health issues sparked discussions about how celebrities are treated when they spiral. Should they be punished, pitted, or helped? The conversation around Miller often lacked nuance. Some dismiss their actions as unforgivable, while others excuse them entirely in the name of illness. Yet their story highlights a reality that is neither simple nor comfortable. Mental health struggles do not erase accountability, and accountability does not erase suffering. In the end, Ezra Miller's legacy may be one of contradiction. They will be remembered both as a trailblazer for representation and as a cautionary tale of celebrity excess. They embodied freedom and chaos, inspiration and destruction, vulnerability and violence. To some, they are a tragic figure whose demons destroyed them. To others, they are an abuser who squandered privilege and hurt those around them. What unites these perspectives is the recognition that Miller's story is not just about one person. It is about the fragile, often toxic relationship between fame, identity, and power. As Hollywood moves forward, Miller's name will linger as a reminder that talent alone is never enough, that representation cannot shield someone from accountability, and that the spotlight, for all its glory, can just as easily expose as it can illuminate. In the end, the story of Ezra Miller is neither a simple tragedy nor a simple scandal. It is both, layered with contradictions that refuse easy answers. Here was a young actor who once embodied possibility, who became a symbol of individuality and defiance in an industry notorious for conformity. They stood as proof that Hollywood could evolve, that representation mattered, that authenticity could triumph. And yet those same qualities, untamed, uncompromising, and chaotic, became the seeds of their undoing. What makes Ezra Miller's story so haunting is not only the collapse itself, but the promise that preceded it. When audiences watch them as Patrick in The Perks of Being a Wallflower, or as Credence in Fantastic Beasts, they saw vulnerability, depth, and brilliance. Those performances remain untouched by scandal, preserved in film as proof of what was possible. But film cannot exist in isolation from reality. For every moment of cinematic brilliance, there are headlines of arrests, allegations, and trauma. The art and the artist are forever entangled, and that entanglement is what makes this story so difficult to reconcile. For Hollywood, Miller's fall is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked fame and the consequences of ignoring warning signs. For fans, it is a painful reminder that idols are only human, that even those who appear fearless on screen can be consumed by their own shadows. And for Ezra Miller themselves, the legacy remains unwritten. Redemption is never impossible, but the path is steep, and the wounds left behind are deep. Perhaps that is the ultimate truth of this story. Fame does not protect, it exposes. It magnifies both brilliance and weakness, both triumph and collapse. Underneath the spotlight, there is no place to hide. Ezra Miller's rise and fall is not just a story about one actor. It is a reflection of Hollywood itself, of the perilous dance between power and vulnerability, of how quickly adoration can turn into infamy. And as the credits roll on this chapter of their life, the question remains, will Ezra Miller ever find their way back from a darkness, or will their name forever remain a cautionary echo in Hollywood's long history of broken stars?